lovely people, my name is Emma and today we are doing an overly specific book recommendations video for books about workers' rights and people being exploited or shit upon by companies. Incredibly niche, quite specific, and even though I've said book recommendations, I actually have 2 books and 3 podcast episodes in particular, because I do find that I actually have more podcasts than books for this particular topic. But I read something very recently and it kind of caused my brain to sort of have one of those like little firestorms of connections between things, and I wanted to do this as a recommendations video and a general shout out for a request for recommendations for books in this kind of an area where there have been failings of safeguarding and health and safety things put in practice, or nothing in the first place and people have suffered because of it, but then the outcome has been hopefully positive. So I hope that makes sense. Let's jump in with the books. The first one is probably the most well-known of all of the things I'm going to talk about, and that is The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. This is a history of the Radium Girls, who were a group of women who worked for a watchmaking factory who were tasked with basically painting the dials and like the hands and the numbers of the clock face, but they were using radium paint. There was a period of time where, so radium is highly radioactive and incredibly dangerous for people, but there was a period of time in our kind of medical history where we weren't aware of this fact and we thought it was actually beneficial for our health. So the girls would paint with the radium paint, quite often using their mouths to like create a point for the paintbrushes, and were being heavily exposed to this incredibly dangerous material. It also then came out that even after we found out that this was a problem, the company still continued to let them use this and basically refused to pay for any of their medical expenses or compensate them in any meaningful way. The women all died in incredibly horrific, horrible circumstances. Radiation poisoning is something that you cannot treat. It is in your body and you're reliant on the half-life that is going to kill you before it goes. And if you want to keep yourself up at night, there are some truly awful photos of what happened to these women as their bodies kind of decayed and cancers grew and all sorts of things. This is an incredibly powerful book that looks at their lives, their struggle, and the subsequent changes to workers' rights that happened because of this fact, and it's very much considered kind of a landmark case within workers' rights. So really fascinating read. Kate Moore has an incredibly good handle on the history and writes it with a lot of sensitivity. It is a very difficult read, but a really important and meaningful one. The next book I want to talk about is A Silent Fury, The El Bordo Mine Fire by Yuri Herrera. This is actually the book that kind of sparked me thinking about this topic in a little bit more detail. I read this in December and it is a short non-fiction piece, almost like a long form essay, that is looking at the El Bordo mine fire that happened, I think it was in the 1920s in Mexico. I will double check. Yep, 1920 in Mexico. And this was a fire that occurred, but the mine was actually closed up, and the people who owned the mine said that there was no way that anybody would be surviving in there, and they were all dead already, and all attempts to rescue them had sort of occurred, and that the mine's safety features were definitely up to scratch. In reality, subsequent investigation showed that when they opened the mine back up a couple of days later, 10 men were actually still alive, and there were very obvious signs that very many people were dying in those couple of days rather than dead already, and a lot of the safety features were not there. And this is a look at the way that the company tried to cover up, discredit, besmirch, and generally did awful things to these families and these men to avoid payouts and to avoid any kind of sort of criminal kind of action against them. It is a short book, but it does look at then sort of the ramifications of workers' rights that have happened since then, and the kind of ways that people have fought for people of the lower class. I think this one was in Mexico. Yes, look at me remembering stuff. I'm so proud. So yeah, it was an incredibly harrowing read. I actually listened to an audiobook and you can really feel the rage and frustration of the narrator, like the narrator is putting into the words. It is an incredibly powerful and moving piece. So those are the 2 books that I wanted to talk about, but I also wanted to talk about podcasts, because this is the kind of thing that you might not want to do a whole entire book on, and there's a lot of really great content out there. So the first one I want to talk about is the asbestos episode from This Podcast Will Kill You. This looks at what asbestos actually is. It's a mineral that you mine from the ground. Did anybody else have no freaking idea about that, and then looks at the fact that we now know that asbestos is incredibly harmful and damaging to the human body, but the ways that we have sort of struggled to, both that information has been sort of kept quiet, people have refused to pay out over the various years, and the various people who kind of suffer from this, focusing on a couple of towns in particular who were sort of the epicenters for mining the asbestos. So naturally the people who were involved in that were heavily exposed to asbestos and had fairly awful health ramifications because of it. It's an incredibly interesting thing from a like biology science perspective, but also incredibly frustrating and moving from a, again, workers' rights, fair compensation, and making companies really face what they have done and what they have forced people to do kind of episode. From the same podcast, I also wanted to talk about Bhopal, the 1984 Union Carbide disaster. This is an incredibly moving episode about a disaster I knew nothing about, and it was amazing and harrowing in equal measure. Bhopal is a city in India, and it was basically the Union Carbide company who had factories out there that were involved in making a particular cleaning product, but the particular problem was actually a secondary or kind of tertiary ingredient that occurred in the process of making this cleaning product, which meant that it didn't have to meet anywhere near the same kind of level of regulations and standards to check its dangerousness. Yeah, sure. And also to regulate and limit sort of the control, how much of it needed to be stored, etc, etc. There was a disaster that led to an incredibly awful gas leak that basically killed and damaged a huge number of people, and is still having ongoing repercussions in Bhopal to this day. And this podcast is a look at what is the ingredient, whose name I cannot remember right now, I'm really sorry, but also how did this happen, and the various sort of, again, constant feigning ignorance but actually knowing what they were doing situations that occurred that led to this disaster, and also the other disasters that United Carbide have been involved in the past. So sketchy as fuck company, and really, really interesting to learn about. The final one I wanted to mention is You're Wrong About podcast, specifically the Exxon Valdez oil spill episode. This is a really interesting look at a particular oil spill, the reasons why it happened, the kind of cover-up connected to it, and the amount of repatriation kind of sort of funds paid out to the people, and then the long, like, consistently quibbling them in court so that they get knocked down to nothing that kind of occurred. This is less about sort of the health of the people involved, unlike most of the things discussed in this, but it is a conversation about a town or like an area of a kind of coastline that had its entire economy completely destroyed by the fact of this oil spill, and again the repeated small failings that led to this, and the subsequent cover-up, consistent trying to kind of deny any responsibility that happened from it. This is sort of early You're Wrong About podcast. This is back when Mike was still one of the hosts as well. It was Sarah and Mike back then, and I really love some of these earlier episodes where they're still trying to find their feet and they're really kind of coming up with sort of what the podcast is. I actually have a whole separate mini review of the You're Wrong About podcast, which I will link in the various places. They're an incredible resource for finding out about things that, like the name suggests, you were wrong about. The general kind of consensus popular understanding was that you're wrong about, or indeed you possibly never heard of because it was sort of covered up and hushed up before it could become a major news story. I've picked up the Exxon Valdez one, but I also do want to shout out the Ford Pinto, which is a really interesting look at how we thought that there was a company doing something bad, but it turns out we might have been wrong. So this is just a slight little kind of silver lining. Maybe companies aren't completely awful at the end of this video, which is very anti-capitalist, anti-corporation right now, to say that the Ford Pinto one is really interesting look at the way that all cars were terrible back then, and all cars would make you nearly die in a fiery wreck, not just the Ford Pinto. Spoiler alert if you're planning on listening to that episode. Those are 2 books and a couple of podcasts about workers' rights, workers' safety, and companies who really should have got the comeuppance and didn't in many cases. Do let me know in the comments down below if you have any other recommendations in this area. Obviously, there is a lot of content out there about Chernobyl, which I have not personally read yet. I do intend to at some point, but it's a case of kind of finding which one of the many books to take on and read. But I'm sure that there are plenty others that would fit into this category, and it is something that I do find very interesting, especially the legal side of things. It's something that I'm finding myself reaching for more and more. So do let me know, and like I say, I'm open to podcast episodes as well. They don't have to be these long form 300-page books. Sometimes a simple hour and 15-minute podcast on a subject is all you actually need. So let me know in the comments down below. Are you going to listen to any of these? Are you going to read any of these? Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye.